On the arid coastal plain of southern Peru, between the Andes rising to the east and the cold Pacific a few dozen kilometers to the west, there is a stretch of desert so dry that some parts of it haven't seen meaningful rainfall in living memory, a place where almost nothing decays because almost nothing ever gets wet enough to rot. It's exactly the kind of forgotten, featureless ground you'd expect a pilot to fly over without a second glance, which is more or less what happened for centuries, until commercial aviation started crossing this stretch of Peru in the 1920s and pilots began radioing back strange reports of lines etched into the desert floor below them, dead straight, running for kilometers, and here and there resolving, if you caught the angle just right, into enormous drawings, a hummingbird with its beak nearly 200 feet long, a spider, a monkey with a spiraling tail, a condor with a wingspan wider than a football field is long. From the ground, walking across them, you would see almost nothing at all, just a shallow trench, a slightly lighter strip of gravel underfoot, nothing to suggest you were standing inside a masterpiece. Only from several hundred feet up, from a vantage point no one on Earth had access to until the 20th century, did the desert finally reveal what had been scratched into it, and reveal it so completely that it raised a question that still doesn't have a fully satisfying answer. Tonight's story is about the Nazca Lines, the people who made them roughly 2,000 years ago with no ability to see their own work from above, and the slow, patient unraveling of what these lines were actually for. The lines weren't actually discovered by those 1920s pilots, not in any first contact sense, though it's easy to see why the story usually gets told that way. A Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Zesp had already noticed some of the ground-level line segments while hiking through the desert foothills in 1927, recognizing them as deliberate human constructions rather than natural features and eventually publishing a short scientific paper describing them in 1939. Work that received little attention outside a small circle of Peruvian scholars. It was the American historian Paul Kosok, arriving in 1941 to study ancient irrigation systems in the region, who first grasped the line's full strangeness, and the story of exactly how he grasped it has become something close to a founding legend for Nazca research. Standing at one particular line on the evening of June 22, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, Kosok watched the sun set directly over the line's far end, and reportedly turned to his wife and declared that they were standing in what amounted to the world's largest astronomy book, a phrase that would go on to shape decades of research into the lines that followed. Kosok's own fieldwork was cut short by the outbreak of the Second World War, but before leaving Peru he introduced a young German mathematician working as a governess and translator in Lima to the site, a woman named Maria Reich who would go on to spend the rest of her life there. The Nazca culture that produced them flourished along Peru's southern coast roughly between 100 BCE and 800 CE, centered on the valleys of the Nazca and Ica rivers, drainages that carry snowmelt down from the Andes through some of the driest inhabited land on the planet before finally reaching the sea. These were not people struggling at the margins of survival. They were skilled farmers who had learned to coax cotton, maize, beans, and squash out of narrow river valleys hemmed in by lifeless desert on both sides, and they were, by any honest measure, extraordinary artists. Nazca pottery, painted in as many as a dozen mineral-based colors fired directly onto the clay rather than applied afterward, ranks among the most technically accomplished ceramic traditions anywhere in the ancient Americas, decorated with the same vivid menagerie of birds, sea creatures, plants, and mythological figures that shows up again in their textiles and, as it would eventually turn out, in the lines themselves. There's no indication the Nazca had any system of writing, no king lists, no inscriptions, nothing that records in their own words who they understood themselves to be. Almost everything known about them comes from what they left buried in the ground, in cemeteries, in the remains of settlements, and scratched across an unbroken expanse of desert floor that, by sheer accident of climate, has barely changed in 2,000 years. That climate is really the entire reason any of this survived at all. The Nazca Desert receives, on average, a matter of minutes of rainfall a year, and the ground itself is covered by a thin layer of dark, iron oxide-coated stones sitting atop a bed of pale yellowish-gray sand and clay underneath, a natural contrast built directly into the landscape. Nazca artisans didn't dig trenches or pile up embankments to make their lines. They simply cleared the darker surface stones away, exposing the lighter ground beneath, and then, in many cases, arranged the removed stones into low borders running alongside the resulting pale strip, which lightened the contrast even further and helped keep the line's edge crisp. It's a remarkably simple technique, requiring nothing more sophisticated than patient, coordinated hand labor, and it's precisely because it's so simple, so lightly worn into the desert's surface rather than carved deep into it, that a strong wind or a hard rain could theoretically erase whole figures in an afternoon. The fact that it hasn't happened, that lines etched sometime in antiquity are still crisply visible today, says less about the durability of the technique and more about how astonishingly, almost eerily still this stretch of desert has remained across 2 millennia. What actually exists out there is far larger, and far stranger, than the handful of famous animal figures that show up on postcards. Researchers have now documented several hundred individual geoglyphs across roughly 450 square kilometers of desert, ranging from the instantly recognizable biomorphic figures, the hummingbird, the monkey, the spider, the condor, a killer whale, various stylized birds and plants, to something far more numerous and, in its own way, more mysterious. Thousands of perfectly straight lines and enormous geometric shapes, trapezoids, triangles, spirals, some running for as long as 9 kilometers across the desert floor without so much as a curve or a correction. The animal figures, spectacular as they are, actually make up a small fraction of the total. The straight lines dominate the landscape, radiating outward in bundles from certain high points, crossing and recrossing each other in patterns that, walked at ground level, must have felt less like looking at a picture and more like walking a labyrinth with no discernible center. And that raises the most obvious question anyone asks the first time they see aerial photographs of this place: if the figures and the geometric patterns can only really be appreciated from the air, and the Nazca had no aircraft, no hot air balloons that anyone has managed to demonstrate archaeologically, how did they manage to lay out shapes this large, this precise, without ever once seeing the finished result themselves? The Nazca weren't the first people in this stretch of desert to draw on this scale either, and the layer of history sitting just beneath their work adds an important wrinkle to the whole picture. On the hillsides overlooking the town of Palpa, a short distance north of the main Nazca Plain, researchers have documented an earlier generation of geoglyphs, cut into sloped terrain rather than flat desert floor, attributed to the Paracas culture that flourished in the same region centuries before the Nazca themselves emerged, roughly 800 to 100 BCE. Because these earlier figures were carved into hillsides rather than perfectly level ground, many of them are actually visible, at least in outline, from surrounding high points without needing any aircraft at all, which strongly suggests the flat desert version the Nazca perfected afterward represents a genuine technical evolution of an existing local tradition rather than an idea that appeared out of nowhere. The Paracas are independently famous for an entirely different kind of ancient craftsmanship, extraordinarily preserved textiles recovered from desert burial sites and, more unsettlingly, a documented practice of deliberate skull elongation and early trepanation, cranial surgery performed with obsidian and other sharp tools, some of it showing clear evidence that patients survived the procedure and lived for years afterward. Whatever ritual and cosmological framework connected hillside figures, funerary practice, and cranial modification for the Paracas, it's the cultural soil the Nazca Line building tradition grew out of, inherited, adapted to flat ground, and eventually carried to a scale and precision the Paracas themselves never attempted. The honest answer, worked out through decades of painstaking fieldwork rather than any single dramatic discovery, is that you don't actually need to see a shape from above to build it accurately at ground level, provided you're willing to work with stakes, cord, and a great deal of geometric patience. Researchers have found wooden stakes still embedded at the ends of some lines, precisely where the geometry would predict a survey point ought to be, and experiments have shown that a small team working with not much more than rope, stakes, and a fixed central point can lay out a large, accurate figure using nothing more advanced than basic proportional scaling, sketching a smaller version first, perhaps on the ground nearby or even just held in the collective memory of the work crew, and then enlarging it stake by stake, cord by cord. It's slow, it's exacting, and it requires real coordination among the people doing the clearing, but it isn't mysterious in the sense of being technologically impossible for a Bronze Age society without metal tools or wheeled vehicles. What it does require is motivation serious enough to justify that kind of sustained, coordinated labor across generations, for a result its own builders, walking the lines at ground level, may genuinely never have seen in the complete form we now take for granted from an airplane window. Coming up with that motivation has occupied researchers for the better part of a century, and while there's no single settled consensus, one theory dominated public understanding of the lines for decades largely through the sheer force of one researcher's life's work. Maria Reich, a German-born mathematician who first visited the Nazca Desert in 1940 and ended up devoting essentially the rest of her life to surveying, measuring, and personally protecting the lines from erosion, cattle, and eventually tourist traffic, argued that many of the straight lines and figures functioned as an enormous astronomical calendar, with individual lines aligned to the rising or setting points of the sun, moon, and particular stars at significant points in the agricultural year. She spent decades living out in the desert, often sweeping lines clear of debris with a broom at her own expense, converting what had been a scattered curiosity into a documented, protected UNESCO World Heritage Site by the time of her death in 1998. Later, more rigorous statistical analysis of the line's orientations found that Reich-specific astronomical alignments held up for only a modest fraction of the total lines, no better, in fact, than pure chance would predict across a landscape with this many lines pointed in this many directions, and today most specialists treat the pure astronomical calendar theory as, at best, a partial explanation rather than the master key Reich believed she'd found. Her contribution to preserving the site, though, remains beyond dispute regardless of how her central theory has aged. Reich lived for years in a small house at the edge of the desert with no running water, funded her survey work largely out of her own pocket, and on at least one occasion physically intervened to stop road-building crews from bulldozing straight across the lines during construction of the Pan American Highway, a battle she eventually won only in part, since the highway does still cross the plain, slicing directly through the long straight body of the lizard figure near the road's edge, a compromise etched permanently into the desert. By the time of her death in 1998, the Peruvian government had granted her honorary citizenship and named her the site's de facto guardian, and it's largely thanks to her decades of stubborn, self-funded advocacy that Nazca was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994 rather than being left, like so many similarly remote archaeological landscapes, to the slow accumulation of tire tracks and foot traffic. It's worth addressing directly the theory that, for a certain slice of popular culture, has become almost as well known as the lines themselves, the claim, popularized by the Swiss author Erich von Däniken in his 1968 bestseller Chariots of the Gods, that the lines functioned as landing strips or signaling markers for ancient extraterrestrial visitors. Evidence, in von Däniken's reading, that the Nazca themselves could never have produced work this large and this precise without outside help. Serious archaeologists rejected the claim almost immediately and have continued rejecting it in the decades since, for reasons that are honestly pretty straightforward once you've actually stood in the desert and looked at how the lines were made. The wooden survey stakes recovered at line endpoints, radiocarbon dated to squarely within the Nazca period, are physical evidence of exactly the kind of ground-based construction method described earlier, requiring nothing beyond rope, patience, and basic geometry. No excavation anywhere on the site has ever turned up material remotely consistent with landing infrastructure, and the ground itself, loose gravel over soft sand and clay, would make a genuinely terrible runway for anything heavier than a bicycle. The theory persists in popular imagination less because of any surviving archaeological ambiguity and more because it's a dramatic story that travels well. One more example of a pattern this show keeps circling back to: an ancient society's genuine, hard-won ingenuity gets waved away as impossible, and something outside that society, whether a vanished master race or visitors from beyond the planet entirely, gets credited instead. A different, and today more broadly accepted, line of research reframes the lines less as a calendar to be read and more as a landscape to be walked. Anthropologist Johann Reinhard, building on fieldwork across the Andes documenting how contemporary and historical highland communities treat mountains, water sources, and processional paths as sacred, argued in the 1980s that many Nazca lines converge on or point toward sources of water, whether springs, underground aquifers, or the mountains from which seasonal river flow ultimately descends. In a desert where water was, quite literally, the difference between a thriving farming society and total collapse. In this reading, the straight lines functioned as ritual walkways, paths that Nazca communities processed along, perhaps in coordinated groups, perhaps carrying offerings, as part of ceremonies aimed at petitioning for rain and securing the water that made agriculture possible at all in one of the driest inhabited landscapes on Earth. It's a theory that fits comfortably alongside other evidence from Nazca sites, ceremonial pottery smashed deliberately at certain locations along the lines, offerings of shell and other materials recovered from excavated line segments, that these were not simply engineering exercises but active ritual spaces, walked and used repeatedly over generations rather than built once and left alone. If tonight's slow walk across this quiet, sun-baked plateau, tracing lines meant to be understood by gods or ancestors rather than by human eyes at ground level, has started easing you toward sleep, this is a good point to hit subscribe, because the story is about to move to the strange, mostly empty ceremonial city the lines seem to radiate outward from, and to a practice involving human heads that the Nazca, by all the evidence, did not consider sinister at all. That city, or something like a city, is known today as Kawachi, a sprawling complex of some 40 low earthen mounds and plazas built along the Nazca River roughly 2,000 years ago, and one of the stranger things archaeologists have established about it is that almost nobody actually lived there. Excavations led by Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Orefici across decades of fieldwork found remarkably little evidence of permanent residential occupation at the site's core, no dense neighborhoods of ordinary houses, no accumulated domestic trash of the kind that builds up steadily wherever people are actually living day to day. What Kawachi does contain, in enormous quantities, is evidence of ceremony, elaborate textiles, painted ceramics, pan flutes, and offerings, many of them found deliberately smashed or ritually killed before burial, a practice documented across the Andes in which an object is intentionally broken as part of the act of offering it, rendering it useless for any purpose but the ceremonial one. The best current interpretation is that Kawachi functioned as a pilgrimage center, largely empty most of the year, that filled with people converging from farming communities scattered across the surrounding valleys at particular ceremonial moments, very possibly tied to the same water and fertility concerns the lines themselves seem to express, before emptying out again once the rites concluded. Kawachi's location is itself suggestive. Several major line bundles converge on or pass directly through the site, and researchers have proposed that Kawachi functioned as something like the anchor point of the entire geoglyph network, the destination, or point of origin, for processions walking the surrounding lines. One particularly striking mound at the site, sometimes called the Great Temple, was built up in stages over generations, each new construction phase deliberately burying the one before it rather than replacing it outright, a pattern of ritual renewal rather than simple demolition and rebuilding that echoes practices documented at ceremonial sites across the ancient Andes more broadly. Whatever specific rites were performed there, the scale of accumulated offerings, along with the site's total lack of ordinary domestic architecture, points toward a religious center serving a much wider population than could ever have lived there permanently, a shared ceremonial heart for a society otherwise scattered thinly across isolated desert river valleys separated by genuinely lifeless terrain. Woven through this same religious world is one of the more unsettling elements of Nazca material culture, trophy heads. Archaeologists have recovered dozens of specially prepared human skulls from Nazca sites, heads that show clear evidence of deliberate processing after death, an opening enlarged at the base of the skull, the brain and soft tissue removed, and a cord threaded through to allow the head to be carried or displayed, sometimes recovered still wrapped in cloth, occasionally with the lips pinned shut with cactus spine needles or thorns. Trophy heads appear repeatedly in Nazca pottery and textile imagery too, carried by warrior or shamanic figures, associated visually with plants, agricultural abundance, and what researchers interpret as fertility symbolism, suggesting that whatever violence originally produced these heads, whether warfare, ritual combat, or targeted ritual killing, the heads themselves came to be understood afterward less as war trophies in a purely military sense and more as potent objects tied to ensuring successful harvests and continued fertility of the land, a genuinely different framework for understanding decapitated human remains than the one a modern viewer instinctively reaches for. Isotope analysis of some recovered trophy heads indicates the individuals had grown up eating diets similar to other Nazca people rather than obviously foreign captives, complicating any simple story of heads taken exclusively from defeated outside enemies and suggesting a more complex ritual practice, potentially including individuals from within Nazca society itself, that remains only partially understood. The choice of which animals to render at monumental scale wasn't random either, and a couple of the figures carry details that only make sense once you look closely at exactly which species they depict. The famous spider figure, for instance, has been identified by at least one researcher not as a generic spider but as a close match for a specific and genuinely obscure order of arachnid, one whose distinguishing anatomical features, an elongated reproductive limb tucked beneath the body, are difficult to make out without close, careful, arguably microscope-level observation of a preserved specimen. An odd level of biological precision to bake into a 200-foot line drawing if the figure's meaning was purely symbolic and never meant to reflect the actual creature that closely. The monkey figure raises a different, more geographic puzzle, since monkeys have never lived in this bone-dry coastal desert at any point in the region's history. The nearest wild monkey populations are found across the Andes in the Amazon basin, hundreds of kilometers to the east, which means the figure itself is indirect evidence of contact, trade, or at minimum shared cosmological knowledge reaching between the Nazca and communities on the humid, forested far side of the mountains. connection echoed in Nazca pottery decorated with Amazonian bird and plant imagery that has no local coastal equivalent at all. Sustaining any of this, the farming, the ceremonial pilgrimages, the pottery production, the ordinary daily life of a population large enough to fill Kawachi during its festivals, required solving a problem the desert never stopped posing. How do you keep water flowing reliably through valleys where the rivers themselves often ran dry at the surface for much of the year? The Nazca answer was an engineering system called pukios, a network of spiral-shaped access wells connected to underground stone-lined channels that tapped directly into the water table beneath the dry riverbeds, drawing on groundwater that continued flowing even when the visible surface river above it had stopped. Dozens of these pukios, built without iron tools, following the natural slope of the water table with real hydraulic sophistication, still function today, still supplying water to farmers in the Nazca Valley 2,000 years after they were first dug, a genuinely remarkable piece of ancient infrastructure that receives a fraction of the attention paid to the lines above it, despite arguably representing an even more impressive solution to the same underlying problem the lines themselves seem to have been ritually addressing. For all that ingenuity, the Nazca world didn't last forever, and the story of its unraveling is, like so much else here, only partly resolved. Sediment cores and other paleoclimate evidence from the region point to a series of major El Niño events, the periodic warming of Pacific surface waters that can trigger catastrophic flooding along Peru's normally bone-dry coast, striking the Nazca valleys with particular severity sometime around 500 to 600 CE, a climate disruption compounded, according to research led by archaeologist David Beersford-Jones, by a slower, self-inflicted crisis playing out over preceding generations. The Nazca had been steadily clearing the warango, a slow-growing, deep-rooted native tree whose extensive root system stabilized riverbank soil and helped maintain the local water table, to make room for expanding cotton and maize cultivation. With warango cover reduced across the valley floor, the land lost much of its natural resistance to catastrophic flood erosion right around the time unusually severe El Niño flooding actually arrived, a combination that appears to have devastated valley agriculture and, not long afterward, coincides closely with Kawachi's own decline and eventual abandonment as an active ceremonial center. It's a pattern that will sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone who's followed this show before, a sophisticated, resourceful society optimizing its landscape right up to the edge of what that landscape could actually sustain, and then meeting an external climate shock precisely when its own margin for absorbing it had grown thinnest. The Nazca Line building tradition itself didn't end abruptly with Kawachi's decline, continuing in modified form for some generations afterward even as the broader society reorganized, and eventually the region came under the growing influence of the Wari, an expanding highland empire whose reach extended across much of the Peruvian coast by the later first millennium CE, absorbing Nazca communities into a much larger political world before the Wari's own empire eventually fragmented in turn. Centuries later, long after the last lines had stopped being maintained or expanded, the desert simply held on to them, undisturbed, largely unnoticed by the outside world until those startled radio reports started coming in from aircraft crossing overhead in the 1920s and 30s. Even now, the site keeps yielding new discoveries rather than settling into a fixed, fully catalogued inventory. In recent years, researchers using drone photography, satellite imagery, and increasingly, machine learning models trained to spot faint geoglyph traces invisible to the casual eye, have identified well over 100 previously undocumented figures across the wider Nazca region, a startling reminder that a landscape people have been formally studying for the better part of a century still isn't fully mapped. Some of the most striking recent additions to the catalog have come not from new fieldwork on the ground but from a research partnership between Yamagata University in Japan and IBM, which trained a machine learning model on existing aerial and satellite imagery of confirmed geoglyphs and then set it loose scanning the surrounding desert for faint traces too subtle for the human eye scanning photographs to reliably pick out. That project alone identified well over 100 additional figures between 2019 and 2022, mostly smaller, simpler human and animal forms clustered nearer to ancient roads and settlements rather than out among the grand geometric lines, adding an entire secondary layer to the site that spent nearly 2,000 years going completely unnoticed even by researchers who had already spent decades walking and surveying this same ground on foot. It's a genuinely strange thing to sit with, that a landscape this thoroughly photographed, mapped, and studied for the better part of a century could still be quietly hiding hundreds of images that only an algorithm, scanning patiently and without fatigue across enormous volumes of imagery, finally noticed. That same fragility that preserved the lines for 2,000 years now works against them in an era of highways, illegal mining, and a changing climate. An unauthorized truck route cut directly across two of the figures in 2014, and industrial squatters and off-road vehicles have damaged sections of the surrounding protected zone more than once in recent decades, each incident a blunt reminder that a mark scratched into gravel, however monumental from the air, remains only a few centimeters deep and entirely at the mercy of whoever happens to drive across it. One particularly widely reported incident in 2014 involved a group of environmental activists who walked out onto the plain beside the hummingbird figure to lay out a large banner for a publicity stunt timed to a climate summit, leaving footprints permanently pressed into ground so undisturbed that those footprints remain visible today, a small, almost accidental demonstration, delivered by people who presumably meant no harm at all, of exactly how little pressure it takes to leave a permanent mark on a surface this delicate. So the story closes here without the tidy resolution it would be satisfying to offer. We know, with real confidence now, how the Nazca built these lines, patient surveying with stakes and cord, requiring no aerial view and no lost technology to explain. We know a great deal about who built them, a skilled, ceremonially rich farming culture whose art and religion clearly threaded straight through this landscape of lines, trophy heads, and an all-but-empty pilgrimage city. What we still don't know, and what may simply be unrecoverable without the writing system this culture never developed, is which of the many good, evidence-based theories, the astronomical calendar, the water ritual processional path, some combination neither modern researcher has fully articulated yet, actually captures what walking those lines meant to the people who spent generations of their lives quietly, patiently clearing them.